Hello and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. This week, as Russian and Ukraine troops wage war in Eastern Europe, how prepared is the U.S. for a broader conflict? Are we prepared at sea, in the air, on land to fulfill our commitments to our Western allies? And how does our current energy profile impact our strategic concerns? Former U.S. Navy Secretary, Mississippi's 60th Governor, Ray Mabus is here to talk about these issues, his current efforts, and his view on today's politics at the state capitol. That's all coming up this Sunday morning on Mississippi Insight. Few Mississippians are better placed for our discussion this morning. Ray Mabus is also a former ambassador to Saudi Arabia and currently heads the Mabus Group. It's a strategic advisory group that helps public and private clients navigate global change. Governor Mabus, welcome to Mississippi Insight.
Glad to be here, Byron. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, let's discuss Russia and its invasion of Ukraine and how it's impacted to the U.S. NATO, our military alliance with our European partners, is at the heart of this conflict in some ways. And there's been some great concern in the West about a potential broader conflict, one that would pull NATO partners bordering Russia into a direct conflict. Your understanding our strategic concerns in Europe is NATO and specifically the United States prepared for a potential war with Russia if Vladimir Putin tries to escalate this conflict?
Well, NATO and every country in it, the United States in particular, has been very, very firm about the fact that they're going to honor Article 5, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. There has been no equivocation there. There's been no hesitancy there. So I think if Putin is dumb enough to move across any NATO border, then you really do risk a much wider conflict. But one thing that the war in the Ukraine has shown is just how hollow and bad the Russian forces are, and particularly their ground forces. But in an all-out confrontation with NATO, NATO would just win overwhelmingly. But then you've got to consider that Russia's a nuclear power and that you've got an unstable leader there who doesn't seem to know or care about what happens to other people or to civilians or to the wider world.
So your thoughts on Ukraine's defense at this point in the invasion? I mean, they've been holding fairly strong right now.
They've been holding up great. The Ukrainians have been fighting for the last 8 years in eastern Ukraine at two breakaway republics, and that have had the help of Russia. But the Ukrainians are also fighting for their homeland, for their families, for their freedom. The Russians, a lot of them are conscripts. It's unclear to them, it seems, what they're fighting for. And, this was completely unnecessary. It was irrational. The fact that it looks like it was done, as I said, by an unstable leader based on some grievances that he had. He said the biggest tragedy of the 20th century was the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so when you've got somebody like that who is also incredibly isolated, he evidently is getting no information or the wrong information. And even the pictures you see of him, he's sitting 20 feet away from anybody, from his advisors. And because it's going so badly for him, I mean, he's arrested a bunch of the head of his defense establishment and of his spy agencies. So you've got an unstable, unpredictable, irrational actor here that the Ukrainians have really, really done well. And we ought to keep arming them with just about everything they need. When you're able to arm them with things like Javelin anti-tank weapons and Stinger anti-aircraft weapons, having tanks and aircraft become a much, much less overwhelming advantage, because these are things that can be carried by one person. They're incredibly accurate, incredibly destructive. I do think we ought to, which evidently is being discussed, provide them with anti-aircraft facilities that can take down higher flying aircraft. We ought to pour everything we have, we in NATO, into this defense, with the possible exception of the old MiGs that Zelensky keeps asking for. Those are, it seems to me, mainly symbolic. I don't think they would make a huge difference in this war, but if Zelensky wants them, and if the Ukrainians, if it will help their morale, then probably some way ought to be figured out to do that. But they are doing such an amazing, courageous job, and the Russians have just basically given up militarily, and now they're resorting to terror. It can't be described as anything but terrorism, what they're doing. Firing missiles at apartment complexes, at hospitals, at child care centers, at a theater that was a bomb shelter. They have resorted to just the worst war crimes ever, and the Ukrainians are holding firm. And so we ought to help them any way we can, absent getting into an all-out war, which could easily turn into World War III with Russia.
Russia is a major energy producer, and the war is a huge factor, if not the only one, in our high fuel prices at home. Energy is also a big top concern for our European partners. Is this a problem we can simply drill our way out of? And is it expanding domestic production the key, or are we missing something here?
We can't drill our way out of it, no way. And expanding domestic production actually strengthens people like Putin. Oil prices are set on the world. They're set globally. We can drill all we want to, and we can produce all we want to. And a dictator like Putin can make the price of oil and gas just shoot up, spike. And so by not moving to renewables really fast, what we do is we give control of our economy, and we give control of our families' pocketbooks in terms of whether they can afford gas or not, to dictators. I mean, most of the oil produced in the world outside the US is produced by countries run by dictators. And the thing that causes the price of oil to shoot up is uncertainty. Uncertainty like a war in Ukraine. But this is Putin's price spike. This is not a result of the US not drilling as much. But the only way we can undercut Putin, and the only way we can get to real energy independence, is to get off of oil and gas, get off this dependence we have on oil and gas, move really aggressively toward renewables, which are, local. If you use solar and wind and agricultural biomass, that's local. And, it's bulletproof from outside influences. We should not let the dictators of the world determine how much gas costs at the pump, which is exactly the power we've given them right now.
We'll talk more about energy concerns and get some state politics with former Governor Ray Mabus when Mississippi Insight continues. We'll be right back. You're leading an advisory firm with focus on resilience, and a lot of that work involves innovations in high-tech fields, including renewable energy technology. What's our biggest challenge as a society when it comes to the challenges of providing clean, affordable energy to the Americans who need it?
the biggest challenge is just the will to do it. I mean, alternative energy today, wind, solar, even biofuels, agricultural biomass, things like, corn stalks and wheat stalks and timber tops and limbs, particularly solar and wind, are so much cheaper today than any other energy. I mean, they're significantly cheaper than energy produced by natural gas, which is the cheapest fossil fuel that we have. So you're seeing company after company, big company after big company in this country moving toward renewables, because it's not only good for the country, it's not only good for the planet, it's really good for the bottom line. So this notion that we can't do it, or the notion that we've got to choose between what's good for the bottom line and good for the planet, is just false now. And we can do it pretty fast. Wind, solar can be built very fast. And you're seeing that move, you're seeing that movement, but it's the attention paid to it, and it's not getting sucked into more oil and gas, into more drilling, into which makes us less independent the more that we do it. Because, as I said, we do not determine the price that we pay at the pump. That's a worldwide thing. And even if we increase our drilling, and right now, to help our allies, help the Ukraine, we ought to do whatever we can. I mean, it's going to take a little while to move aggressively to alternatives, but it's not going to take that long. I moved the Navy and Marine Corps mostly off fossil fuels as a warfighting measure, because it gave us an edge. It gave us an advantage. And today on our bases, 2/3 of all our energy comes from renewables. And it saved the taxpayers of this country $400 million by moving it. So it's just the yes, we can do it. And it's things like passing the climate parts of Build Back Better, the incentives to move to alternatives, the infrastructure, the charging stations, the things like that people are going to need for electric vehicles, that people are going to need to move their electricity from the power plants that the power companies are going to need to. They're already beginning to do it, but we could speed it up a good bit.
Yeah, you've watched as the White House and Democrats in Congress failed to push through some of that Build Back Better agenda that you mentioned. Do you think that the Democrats can manage some version of those initiatives before potential party losses in November?
I hope that we can pass the energy parts of this. I hope we can pass the whole thing. I mean, the fact that you're not offering childcare or universal pre-K to this country. I mean, we ranked 40th in quality of life for families in the world. And, we need to do the whole thing. But the energy things, if we don't do these things, I mean, if you want to put it on purely national security grounds, we are allowing our economy to be dictated from overseas. We're allowing the gas at the pump to be dictated from overseas. Our bases, because of climate change that's being driven by the use of fossil fuels. If we don't change, the biggest naval base in the world, Norfolk, is going to go underwater. It's already having king tides, these exceptionally high tides, all the time now. And if we needed to get the fleet to sea, there's a better than good chance that sailors couldn't get to their ships. These storms are just crushing our bases all across the country, not just along the coast. And sailors and Marines are the first responders around the world. and you're putting them at risk. And when these storms or droughts or floods hit, a lot of times uncertainty follows, and out of uncertainty, sometimes chaos, and then chaos comes conflict. So you're putting sailors and Marines in particular, their lives at risk when they respond to these things. The Arctic is melting. So you're beginning to, and Russia is fortifying, militarizing its northern boundary. So you're seeing the chance for conflict arise there because of climate change and immigration. A lot of immigration that is so huge today is people fleeing because they can't get enough food, because they can't grow enough food, because their homes have been destroyed. And in the US, we today have internally displaced climate change refugees, people whose homes have been somehow made unlivable because of climate change. And so just in national security grounds, if nothing else, we have got to do this, and we've got to do it really fast. The time to do this is shrinking very rapidly. Everything you read about it says that it's speeding up. It's not slowing down. And we just need to take some huge steps this way.
We'll have more with the one-on-one interview with Governor Ray Mabus in a moment. You're watching Mississippi Insight only on 12 News. Bobby Harrison with MississippiToday.org reports that the legislature is set to underfund the Mississippi Adequate Education by about 10% in the next year's budget. Teachers appear to set for pay raises, but some operating budgets will likely take a hit. You were a legal counsel to Governor William Winter back in 1982 when he pushed through the Education Reform Act. That's what paved the way for the MAEP in the first place. What are Mississippians to make of lawmakers' handling of education funding at this point, some 40 years later?
Mississippi is near or at the bottom in every level of educational attainment that there is. And that's not our kids' fault. That's our fault. That's our leaders' fault. 40 years has passed. That's a whole lot of kids going through school. That's a whole lot of children being born and growing up without getting the education that they need and that they deserve and that they're going to have in this rapidly changing world and economy that we have. And we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. I mean, we ought to pay teachers like we pay ball players. We ought to fund education first, and if other things can't be funded, then so be it. But we say we value education. We say we value teachers. And Mississippi is still more than a 90% public education state. More than 90% of our students go to public schools. They don't go to private schools. But even if your children go to private schools, or even if you don't have children or your children are grown, you've got an interest in great education in Mississippi, because for years and years and years, Mississippi's biggest export has been brains, because people just haven't found the opportunity in Mississippi. And the only way to do that, the only way for Mississippi to move up as a state is through better education. And it's got to start in very, very early childhood. It's got to start with prenatal care. It's got to start when children are very, very young. And that there is no magic way. There's not one thing that's gonna, we're all gonna wake up rich and good looking. You're gonna have to do the hard stuff, and it's gonna take decades. But as you just pointed out, we started exactly 40 years ago with the Education Reform Act, and we led the country then. But because we have been just systematically underfunding education and systematically underfunding things like teacher pay, we have not made the movement that we should. And nobody drew a line around the state of Mississippi and said, your children shouldn't get the opportunity. Your children can't compete. Your children can't do as well because of where they're born. And we ought to, as I said, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves for not fully funding education and for getting into I'm going to get into some political stuff. We've got so many educational problems. And these things, these wedge issues, these meaningless things like critical race theory and banning it have nothing, absolutely nothing to do with education and everything to do with politics and power and trying to fool people into thinking that we've got an issue in education that we don't.
Governor Ray Mabus, pleasure talking to you, and thank you for joining us.
Pleasure talking to you, Byron. Take good care.
Thank you, and we'll be right back. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown. From all of us here at 12 News, make it a great weekend.